Always turn off the lights. Part 4. Submitted by Not Afraid of Nothing. The toe worked, at least for 2 days. They took it and all but disappeared. It was such a weight off of my shoulders, we had finally figured out the rule. Of course, now we've run into a really big problem. We can't just keep feeding the things our toes. We knew that one day we'd run out of parts to give them. I had the bright idea to fill up the champagne glass they had left us with blood. I foolishly tried to use pig's blood, but it ended up splattered all over my bedspread and pillows. We started using our own blood, but that glass is so big, and we can't do it every night. We tried spacing it out, just one night, and they killed my favorite cat. We had 3 cats, a long-haired darker cat, a very pale orange cat, and my favorite, Ambrosia, a muted gray calico. I've had her since I was in high school. She was so soft and always slept curled in the crook of my arm. The morning after we didn't fill the champagne glass, she wasn't there. I was terrified. I looked in each room as I passed it, hoping to see her. I barely noticed that the things were following me around surprisingly closely. Somehow I knew what had happened, but I still held out hope. The last room I looked into was the sunroom, and of course, there she was. There was no mess, just her head. Oddly bloodless, her jaw slack and her pink tongue resting on the floor. If it wasn't horrific, it may have been comical. At the time, I wasn't thinking clearly, and ran to her, petting her head and crying. Her head was so small sitting there. Too small. We buried her in the garden and spent the rest of the day outside. I wasn't going back inside the house. We were never going to sleep in there again. I was afraid for our other cats, but they are indoor cats, we can't let them roam out here. We braved the house during the brightest part of the day to pack them up as fast as possible and take them to my mom's. Over dinner, we talked some more about what we had to do. Let's face it, we had been in denial. We know what these things want, and we have for a long time. They want human meat. My mom agreed. She'd heard of something similar from her family. Her great-grandmother was considered very eccentric and would refuse to leave her house. She stayed there and started hoarding weird junk. Her daughter, my mother's grandmother, recalled cleaning out her freezer at the end and finding an abundance of very large cuts of meat. My mom's generation had often speculated that she was actually a murderer, and the meat had been human. The only thing any of them could guess was that her things made her do it. It made me nauseous to think about. Would I be willing to do that? Is that what happened to my great-great-grandmother's estranged husband? I looked over to Stephen. He was looking pale and sick too. But suddenly, a truly terrible thought popped into my head. We hate our neighbor across the street. Everybody hates him. If we could just... It wasn't worth thinking about. At first. We tried selling our house. It's been on the market for weeks, but even the realtors hate it. You can see the pain in their smiles as they walk up to the door. We haven't had a showing yet, and even if we did, selling that house would cost us more than $20,000. The market has gotten really bad since the pandemic started and we're upside down on the mortgage. It only took one night for me to decide to bring up the horrible idea with Stephen. I don't know what's worse. The fact that it was my idea, or that he agreed to do it so quickly. Desperate times call for desperate measures. We left my mom's house during the day and stopped at a hardware store to get a chest freezer. I was afraid an employee would catch me climbing into the things to make sure we got one big enough, but no one saw me. The next stop was our neighbor, John's house. I invited him over to grill out steaks with us that night. We bought too many. I'd said as bubbly as I could, they were on such a great sale. He agreed happily and said, "Only if there's beer." I assured him there would be. My heart sank, but I tried not to let it show on my face. It shouldn't have been so easy. He should have said no. We barely know this guy and don't like him much, why would he come over? A free meal goes a long way, I guess. We pulled out some of the extra meat we'd bought when trying to feed the things, so John wasn't immediately suspicious. I started cutting potatoes with the same knife I'd used on Stephen's dough. My heart was pounding. The things seemed to know what was going to happen. They were hanging out on top of the cabinets in the kitchen, just watching. Waiting. John walked into the kitchen, not knowing anything was wrong, and started to talk to Stephen. I tried a few times to turn suddenly and stab him in the neck, but each time I would chicken out before moving so much as an inch. Stephen was starting to get jumpy and nervous, and John was catching on to the energy. He asked, "What's up, are you guys okay?" That broke the spell on me. I turned to face him, my eyes were so wide, and my face was pulled tight into a grimace. I rammed the knife into his neck. There was so much resistance. It felt like dragging a knife through layers of silk. I thought cutting his neck would mean he'd go fast and not scream. I was so wrong. He screamed and lunged away from me, running into Stephen, who was too shocked to hold him. I lurched toward him and sliced his back, but only shallowly. He and Stephen tumbled slightly, but John was quick. He sprang up and ran into the house, away from me. At least he didn't run outside. The things followed me as I chased him, panic and adrenaline fueling me. He had run into the bathroom and tried closing the door. The biggest thing wouldn't let him. It had wedged itself in the bottom of the door. I paused as I reached the door, adrenaline suddenly draining as I looked at the thing. It was all eyes in that gaping black mouth. Grinning. Waiting. John was frozen too, a new horror spread across his already pale face. He went limp and stopped fighting. I was able to get the knife deeper into his neck. He didn't even look at me. I cringed as I felt the tearing and crunching. The feeling and sound I will never forget. He eventually fell to the floor in the bathroom, either dead or dying, pink foam bubbling from his mouth and neck wound. Stephen had come up behind me and was shaking almost as bad as I was. We sat and watched as the things surrounded the corpse. I expected them to start eating, but they just looked at us. We cleaned up in the kitchen sink and got changed. The things weren't following us. We climbed into the car, but didn't think either of us could drive, so we sat there all night. I had planned to cut John up, leave bits in the freezer. But I was too afraid to pull the meat away from the things. Would they have let me? This morning we came inside the house. Everything was spotless. No sign of any blood or of John. Not even our discarded clothes had any blood on them. The things are nowhere to be seen. I have my house back. It's bright and feels safe. It feels like home again. I can't stop thinking about John, but already it seems distant. Like someone else was actually doing it. I can sleep in peace. My days are filled with restful calm. As I leave the room, I still turn off the lights, but now nothing follows me. I can smile again. If this is the new rule, I think I can make that work.